Welcome to this lecture entitled Local History and the Public Historian. Local history, community history, these are areas that public historians excel at dealing with. And consequently, we'd like to get some kind of definition or at least a list of characteristics for each of these slightly different types of history of small groups. Local history is place-centric. That is, it relies on the physical proximity of people to make itself work. Doing this kind of history of human activity in a locality incorporates geography, physical geography, legal geography, economic geography, social geography. Community history, on the other hand, does not have to be tied to geography, though it can be. It is, in fact, tied to sociology. It is not place-centric necessarily. So what are some examples of non-geographic communities? You'll see communities like groups who follow bands, like deadheads, for example, or fish heads. In fact, what did one deadhead say to the other deadhead when the LSD wore off? Man, this music sucks. I say that as a true deadhead. Football tailgaters are another community, for example, that have a history of their own, as any fan base has a history of its own as well. Cyberspace community based on shared interest, or any other kind of community based on long distance communication of shared interests, allows for a community history to be written. What are some of the topics that you might study in either local or community history? Things to look at. These include power relationships. You can ask many questions of power relationships. Economic placement and relationships. Cultural institutions, including religious institutions. You can look at physical activities, intellectual history of a community, group and subgroup dynamics. You can look at the relationships between the identified community and other communities, internal and external. You can treat it like diplomacy. You can look at the contours of the origins and trajectory over time of the changes that have occurred in any group that you're looking at. Remember, localities and communities span long time frames, and they change their character as younger members replace older members in positions of leadership. So who does the work of local or community history? Many times we call local historians amateurs. However, Carol Common, who is an exceptional writer, a seminal writer in the world of local history, has a real problem with the label amateur, mostly because it's come to become a derogatory term. Rather than meaning for the love of the work, it has come to mean less skilled, less well-trained, agenda-driven. It's also come to be a code for genealogist or heritage advocate, people who are often considered by professional, even public historians, to be not particularly rigorous in their application of historical method. A better term for these people who do not get paid for doing the history that they love to do is avocational historian. Can a community or local history generate income? Indeed, it can. There are professional researchers and genealogists who hold themselves out as consultants, or they work the market, either teaching workshops or conducting research like a consultant would. Some book publishers have still a tradition of printing and selling profitable books based on local history. Often these are assembled by area historians and heritage avocational historians. Usually these are funded by subscriptions of one form or another. And let me make an aside here to say I was, within the past few years, involved in a book like this I was helping put together some of the technical aspects of it, doing a lot of the scanning of images and all of this. And what the book looked like was the first third to half of the book was a story of the locality, complete with pictures. The second half to two-thirds of the book were individual pages with photographs and stories devoted to each of the businesses that had paid a set amount to get their information in there. And it was the payment of the subscription, that is the payment for inserting the information about the business, that allowed the book to be published and for everybody to get paid that needed to get paid, and to generate enough profit that the publisher could afford low sales. There are other ways that local history can be monetized. As historians are absorbed into businesses, which indeed they are being, we're going to see a rise in community studies. We'll need interdisciplinary tools. We'll need to combine local history with sociology with community planning. And we'll need to look at opportunities in environmental history. For example, title companies and planning consultants frequently use local historians to dig through local history records to find out the history of a piece of property, and particularly if there are any environmental concerns about that piece of property in the distant past. So there are opportunities for local historians to monetize their skill set. Let's look at the history of local history in the United States. The history of local history really began in 1656 in England with the Perambulation of Kent, a book written by an author who went out, walked around Kent, that's what perambulation means, and recorded the history as people told it to him. Many folk tales in France also led to the development of a continental interest in local history. In the United States, patrician historians and rising professionals such as newspaper editors, doctors, and lawyers wrote local histories into the 1870s. Their attitudes about local history writing shaped the field into the late 20th century. And their interests were in boosterism, commemoration, lineage, the notion of progress from a benighted past to a enlightened present. This is called Whig history. And they wanted to promote local heroes. They indeed found that change was a threat to the status quo, and so they wanted that minimized in their local history writing. In 1876, we see an uptick in the interest in local history, as well as state and national history, because of the first centennial of the Declaration of Independence. In fact, after 1876, though not immediately, over the course of the following 30 years, modern U.S. history replaced classics as a field of liberal arts study. Another component of the history of local histories were commercial publishers who, in the late 19th century, funded, again like I described, by subscriptions, published local histories that led, unfortunately, to the narrowing of the idea of local history to family histories of those with enough money to pay. And once this set a precedent, then it tended to filter into the other areas of local history writing. Another obvious component of local history, particularly the infrastructure surrounding its writing, were that women became local historians beginning in about the 1880s. Now, part of this occurred because men were professionalizing the discipline of academic history, and so there was a place for men who had formerly written local history and been active in local historical societies, they and their sons, to move into history as a profession, a way of making a livelihood. This left women in charge of these local historical associations. Unfortunately, it led to the denigration of local history as both backwards and antiquarian, and worse, feminized. Remember, the 1880s into the 1920s was an era in which men in the United States feared for their masculinity. One of the great projectors of this idea of hypermasculinity and that the entire society was in danger of becoming feminized was Theodore Roosevelt. Nevertheless, after 1900, the profession of history had ousted local history from it, and Terrell really speaks to this back a few weeks ago when we were looking at him. Anyway, various kinds of local history began to rise again with the 1920s into the 1930s. We see a new location for local history writing, and that's in newspapers. In fact, there were, into the 1950s and 60s even, and in some smaller papers even later than that, features that had either this day in history about local concerns, or that had a writer who contributed a regular column about an issue in local history that this person had found. With the rise of the profession after the 1880s, there was a move among the practitioners of the historical discipline to explain rather than to only recount. We see this in the sub-disciplines that opened up in the historical profession in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 21st century. Some of the first sub-disciplines that wanted to explain rather than recount and that focused on local history was the sub-discipline of urban history. Also, the sub-discipline of social history, which had such a tremendous impact in the 1960s on the entire discipline of history, arose thinking of itself as a discipline that looked at local history. Subsequently, the impact of social, urban, and eventually cultural history led to the academic historians reincorporating local history. They became interested in local history as a group, again, in the 1970s, maybe the 1980s. England and France had, since the 1950s, a robust academic and avocational interest in local history. France, in fact, had an entire school after 1913 called the Annales School that looked not only at social history but focused itself on local history and applying academic rigor and academic standards to the construction of local history, but history from the bottom up. We really can say in this case that the French probably got it more right than just about anybody else, although England did the same kind of thing in its own way, not as influential in the Western concept of how to do history as a discipline, but they did basically the same thing, just a little more parochially. The U.S. has had an expanded interest in local history, not only because of urban and social history, but also because of the impact of the Annales School and the travel of historians back and forth. The legitimization of academic local history has occurred because of the contact between nationalist academic historians in the United States and people who were doing local history at the academic level in England and France. We also experienced an uptick after 1976 with the bicentennial of the Declaration of Independence, which generated a tremendous interest in history and, in fact, a flooding of local historical and state historical societies with avocational historians who had gotten interested again because of the big push to commemorate the bicentennial. Also, at the same time, the TV show Roots came out and did a tremendous service to local history and genealogy in its well done portrayal of the family of Kunta Kinte up to the modern writer Alex Haley, who had, of course, written Roots and also had written the autobiography of Malcolm X. In addition, there was a renewed interest in local history that came from the folk life and folklore side of the equation, another subdiscipline of both history and sociology and American studies. The Foxfire series of books, begun as a newsletter to get high school students interested in local history as a way of getting them interested in history by one teacher in Appalachia. These eventually expanded into 6 extraordinary and large publications called Foxfire. All of this has led to a renewed interest in local history by professional historians. And these professional historians include local historians and primarily include public historians. This then concludes the lecture. I'll leave you to ponder how you might make use of local or community history in your careers. Thank you very much.